Last week we did all of my DNFs of 2019, so why don't we keep the negativity going and do my worst and most disappointing books of 2019? Something about each of these books upset me or let me down, and yet I still continue to read them and finish them, which is probably a bad decision, but now I can give you the information because I have read them and suffered through them so that you don't have to. I'll be going chronologically again based on when I read it during the year. So the first book I have is Eric by Terry Pratchett. I think technically this is a novella, at least the size of it looks like a novella, and it's part of the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, which I am working my way slowly through, and this entry just didn't work at all. I couldn't even tell you what it's about because it had no plot. Nothing followed anything, so events would happen and then they would have no consequences and they would lead nowhere. You would go off in some other random direction and keep going with the book that literally there was no point. It didn't make any sense. Nothing was interconnected. Things didn't follow, and it was just so confusing why this was even a book. It was the most pointless thing I read probably this entire year. The next book is Rise of Empire by Michael J. Sullivan, which is the second book in the Rhaenyra Revelations. And I hated this book. The Rhaenyra Revelations is a very classic fantasy about two guys going on an adventure, saving people and kingdoms and evil religion and stuff, so there's nothing really unique about it, but in particular I hated the second book a lot. To give you an idea of how disconnected this book is, in his interview with Daniel Green recently, he talked about how he dropped an entire book in the middle of the series in order to fix his plot holes and make his ending work. So halfway through the series, we get this book about a whole world and species that we've heard nothing about in the previous books. It comes out of nowhere and there's no explanation for it. I think it was very poorly done. In addition to it being a ship book, which I absolutely hate. I hate ships and I hate any books doing with ships because there's just so much jargon that doesn't make any sense. And when you have a whole new world with new words, new species, new things happening, in addition to ship words that I just don't know, I was so lost the whole time. Plus, some of the characters didn't really follow from the previous books, like their personalities changed, which was also just really weird. So I really didn't like the middle book in the Rhaenyra Revelations. The other ones are fine. They're not great either, but they aren't as bad as the middle book. Next, I'm gonna throw in a manga because if you watched any of my wrap-ups this year, I finished the last part of the Maggie series by Shinobu Otaka, and I complained about every single one because that final arc was absolutely ridiculous. The series follows an Arabian Nights retelling with magic and Aladdin and Alibaba and a bunch of like good versus evil and who decides that and everything, so it gets very philosophical, but the beginning has a lot of really good character work and really good plot lines that make you really feel things and really want to continue in the series, but that is a mistake because the end sucks. Basically, all of the rules and limitations of the magic are completely out the window, so everything is very convoluted and makes no sense whatsoever. And because it's on a much grander scale, it loses the impact that it had in the beginning when everything was much more personal and really affected the reader more. So I really didn't like how this series ended. You can probably tell every time one of those books came up, but I had to finish it because it's 37 volumes and I was so close to the end that I might as well just see it through, and I did, and it probably was a bad idea, but I did it anyway. Another one where the series continuation didn't live up to my expectations based on the beginning of it, and that's the two Howl's Moving Castle sequels by Diana Wynne Jones, which are Castle in the Air and House of Many Ways. I'm absolutely in love with Howl's Moving Castle. I reread it recently and I'm still in love with it. I think it's fantastic. But these two books are not great. Neither of the plots are very well constructed. The third one didn't really have a plot in general. I couldn't tell you what it's about other than a house that has multiple doorways that lead to a lot of different places. There wasn't really a storyline there, where the second book does have a storyline. It's in a Middle Eastern sort of setting, and a lot of the main characters from the first book don't really show up much until like the end. And there are so many ridiculous plot twists, and at the same time the plot meanders, and it's just so not well organized. I did like House of Many Ways a bit more, just because the tone was more similar to Howl's Moving Castle, but not really by much. Unfortunately, Howl's Moving Castle is the best book in the series, and I would recommend you just read that instead of continuing on, because they aren't really related and they aren't really necessary. Next up, we have a nonfiction book, which was A Treasury of Royal Scandals by Michael Farquhar. Technically, I DNF'd this book because I ended up skipping part of it because I was so bored. As the title suggests, it's just a collection of a bunch of scandalous things that the royalty of Europe have done in history, which is interesting enough, but the book was not well organized at all. There was basically no organization, so you were skipping around time periods and skipping around Europe, and it made it very confusing to read and keep track of everyone because they all have the same name because it's royalty in Europe. But also, in addition to the bad organization, there was also a really annoying authorial voice where he kind of sounded like he was condescending and looking down on all of these people, which, yes, they made mistakes, but, like, you don't have to be a jerk about it. Especially when I'm reading it for information and not for this author's opinion. And then jumping into one of the most popular fantasy series, The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, I did not really like at all. This is the start of a massive fantasy series that is very influential in the genre. Again, I can't really explain what it's about, even though I read the first book. It's just too big of a story. It's an epic fantasy, so there are a lot of characters, a lot of different worlds, and a lot happening. So much so that all of the info dumps that Robert Jordan uses to give all of his world information were too much, and they were actually stressful for me because I couldn't keep everything straight, and it was very annoying because there was just so much information all at once. I also couldn't bring myself to care for any of the characters. I don't know what it was. It just didn't really seem like I connected with them at all. It sort of felt like there was a little bit of distance between the reader and each of the characters because there are a lot of different point of views, so you see from a lot of different perspectives, and still you didn't really connect to any of them, or at least I didn't. And then the plot was just too similar to Lord of the Rings, except not done as well. So that was a little bit disappointing. I am continuing in the series just because I want to see what it's all about, but I was not really impressed by the first book. Another book out of the Discworld series by Terry Pratchett, that was Reaper Man, I also felt very disconnected from. It was not my favorite entry in the series by any means. This is the third book, I think, in the Death series, so it follows mainly Death and then a bunch of other things happening in the world, as Terry Pratchett does. And it's about Death learning that he's dying and figuring out that he doesn't really want to die. Something about it just felt off, and I'm not really sure what it is. There was also a very annoying little plot point that kept getting dangled in your face throughout the entire book that made no sense, and I just wanted to know what was happening. And of course, you don't get to know what's happening until the very end, which just made the whole book drag because I was just getting frustrated about this thing that keeps getting brought up every other page that I know nothing about, and it was just really, really annoying. Again, I'm still continuing the series, obviously, but this one was not a good book. And back to another book that a lot of people really love, and that's Trail of Lightning by Rebecca Roanhorse. I did not get on with this book at all, mainly because I didn't like the main character at all. This is set in a world where Navajo gods and monsters are coming down to Earth and messing a lot of things up, and it follows a monster hunter who sort of apprenticed with one of the gods, and then he left her, and she was very smitten and love-struck and trying to find him, and it's very predictable. I loved the world. It was so fascinating, but that's all I liked about the book. The main character is so cocky and so annoying, just like the issue I had with Seven Blades in Black, although the main character of Seven Blades in Black is much worse than the main character in Trail of Lightning. But still, she just got on my nerves, and that you're seeing it through her perspective and you hear her narration the whole time just makes for a very unpleasant read. Plus, it's a cliche character in a cliche plot, so none of that was very interesting. Again, the only interesting part was the world building and the fact that you're in a Native American heritage and all of their folklore that I know nothing about, so I really enjoyed learning about that. But that's the only unique thing about the setup of the book. And then I also had a problem with the writing style because it was really jumpy and stunted. She would use a lot of sentence fragments that really got on my nerves, in addition to some really cheesy flashbacks in order to get backstory. So it wasn't the best storytelling, especially with that tone of voice from the main character, which is my main issue, if you couldn't tell. And then the last book on this list I definitely didn't hate. It just could have used a lot more work, and that's The Book of Nosara by Luke Raven. This book had a lot of potential, but it just didn't deliver it very well. It's about a brother-sister pair who wrote a fantasy book and then they end up finding themselves trapped in it. I thought the world and the concept were really interesting, but the author definitely has to do a bit more work. The character interactions were really, really bad. They were so stereotypical and cookie cutter that they were cringy. And the writing was a bit awkward and sounds like it's trying too hard to be relatable. And the pacing was a little bit weird. It felt fine going through most of the book, and then you reach a sudden climax at the end that sort of didn't feel like a climax and then sort of did. And then it didn't come back down, and there was like no build-up. It was really weird. It didn't really feel like the full, like, you know, introduction, whatever the heck, and then climax, and then down to resolution. It didn't really feel like it followed that, which just made for a really abrupt and unexpected end to the story, and it felt really odd. But again, I think the concept is really interesting. I just wish it was written a bit better. So those are my worst and most disappointing books of 2019. Let me know which book you absolutely hated in 2019 so I can make sure to stay away. That's it for now, and I will see you later. Bye.